morning. Today's lesson comes from Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. So I arrived in Jerusalem. 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding. After dark, I went out through the valley gate, past the Jackal's Well, and over to the Dung Gate to inspect the broken walls and burned gates. Then I went to the Fountain Gate and to the King's Pool, but my donkey couldn't get through the rubble. So, though it was still dark, I went up the Kidron Valley instead, inspecting the wall before I turned back and entered again at the Valley Gate. The city officials did not know I had been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in the administration. But now I said to them, "You know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. They replied at once, "Yes, let's rebuild the wall." So they began the good work. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Gesem the Arab heard of our plan, they scoffed contemptuously. "What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" they asked. I replied, "The God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall, but you have no share, legal right, or historic claim in Jerusalem." Here ends today's reading.
Well, I'll tell you, I started to tear up while she was reading. I mean, she brought God's beautiful word to life. As I look at the times we live in, my hope is for us to be a church that can handle adversity. And even with the ability to rebuild stronger in the face of that adversity. And see, then I think we would be ready for whatever comes, whether good or bad. And so this morning we return to the book of Nehemiah, the memoirs of the person who led the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in the face of much adversity. And so I guess just for you to personalize this, if any of us see a need for rebuilding, whether it be your personal life or your spiritual life, a relationship you're in, the spiritual rebuilding of this country, this temple of God, Spirit of Joy, then God through Nehemiah shows us how best to do that. And so this morning we begin in the second half of chapter 2. As we've seen in chapter 1, God has placed it on the heart of Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And we see in the first part of chapter 2, which I gave you as a reading assignment, that God opens doors for Nehemiah so that he can take the long 1,000-mile journey to Jerusalem. And so here we are in chapter 2, verse 11, where Nehemiah writes, "So I arrived in Jerusalem." He's there. And I think the next words Nehemiah writes are very important for anyone who wants to rebuild something. And so I invite you to take a look at the second sentence of verse 11. And I don't think I'll do it better than Deb did, but I want to relook at these words. And I want you to picture what's going on. And I just want to tell you what's going on. He's making a circle around Jerusalem. But he says, 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. We took no pack animals with us except the donkey I was riding. After dark, I went out through the valley gate, past the jackal's well, and over to the dung gate to inspect the broken walls and burned gates. Then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but my donkey couldn't get through the rubble. So though it was still dark, I went up the Kidron Valley instead, inspecting the wall, before I turned back and entered again at the valley gate. Now, as we take a look at these words, remember God had already put it in Nehemiah's heart to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And the truth is, God may put a plan in our hearts for rebuilding something. Whether it be our spiritual lives, a relationship, our church, or our nation. But what I want you to notice here is that the first thing Nehemiah does is not to start rebuilding. See, we may be people who, once something is placed in our hearts, then we want to get at it, get started. I mean, come on, move it. But I want you to notice that that's not what Nehemiah does. Instead, the first thing Nehemiah does is he takes the time to take a realistic look at what will be needed to succeed. Twice in this passage, if you take a look, Nehemiah talks about inspecting the damage. And the Hebrew word he uses here for inspect means to look into something very carefully. In fact, it's a medical term for probing a wound to see the extent of the damage. You see, we might think it would be discouraging to look at the extent of the damage in our rebuilding situations, whatever they are. And so we might want to skip this step and just see the positive aspects. But again and again, Scripture tells us to take this step, to make an honest appraisal of things before rebuilding. For example, in Luke chapter 14, Jesus says to those considering whether to follow him, he says, but don't begin. But don't begin until you count the cost. He says, for who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? And I think it's very important for all of us sitting here today and for those of you watching online that when Jesus talks about counting the costs, he's not talking about finances. Rather, he wants us to focus on the hardships that will inevitably come in rebuilding projects, even in following him. Jesus wants us to consider the costs before we begin because he wants us to realize that there are costs involved. And so he tells us to first count the cost. Not so that we will become discouraged and give up on rebuilding, but so that we'll be ready for the hard work involved. Because I'll tell you, there's nothing worse than being surprised that it isn't cost-free. And being surprised that there is a cost, we quit. All because we didn't consider the cost involved. And so the first step Nehemiah takes, once God puts it on his heart to do this work of rebuilding, is he takes some time to consider the costs. And in our rebuilding projects, we should take time to do the same. Again, not to discourage us, but to emotionally prepare ourselves for the hard work involved so that we can succeed. And we see this wisdom applied in what Nehemiah tells the people about God's plan to rebuild. To see this, take a look at verse 17. And what I'd like you to notice is how Nehemiah doesn't sugarcoat anything. I mean, he doesn't tell them, this will be a piece of cake. Instead, he tells them the truth. He writes in verse 17, but now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. And its gates have been destroyed by fire. And then, having looked at things honestly, he shows them the next step. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. And in the last sentence of verse 18, it says, so they began the good work. They get started. The first hammer strike is heard in Jerusalem and echoes through that city. The exciting rebuilding process has begun. And I mean, can you sense the excitement of that? The beginning of that project, the first hammer fall? You see, I hope every Christian gets to have the joy of being part of a rebuilding project, of seeing the bright future ahead, of that time of renewed hope. And that's what I hope that we're doing here at Spirit of Joy. And I hope you see that hope. I hope you see that bright future ahead. But I love what Nehemiah shows us next. And this is very important. Because again, it is critical to success in rebuilding. Take another look at the last sentence of verse 18. Verse 18 ends with, so they began the good work. I mean, the excitement. The rebuilding has begun. In verse 19, what is the very next word? But. I mean, I find that gripping. So they began the good work. Oh, the excitement. Oh, we're doing it. We're doing it. The very next word, but. And so picture this. They've just started their rebuilding and already we have a but. And so for anyone who wants to begin a rebuilding project, for anyone who plans to pick themselves up and improve, and for anyone who is in the midst of rebuilding, take careful note of this. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab heard of our plan, they scoffed contemptuously. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They asked. You see, immediately after the exciting work of rebuilding has begun, negative voices come out to play. Immediately after the very first swing of the hammer, Nehemiah and this good work is criticized. And now there's this potential of all the excitement being lost and the rebuilding project coming to a swift end. Kind of like someone puncturing a balloon and all the air goes out of it. And its journey ends. Now I want you to understand that that's what Nehemiah faces here. That situation. The huge excitement of the start of rebuilding is about to end. And you see, in each of us may experience the very same thing when we try rebuilding. We too might hear discouraging voices. Well, one thing we have to realize whenever we begin a rebuilding project, is that almost every significant work, even ones like this that are approved by God, are criticized. I mean, think of anything we now think of as well done. And you would have heard criticism when it started. And let me just give you a few examples. And I could give you hundreds of examples, but for sake of time, I'll just give you these. At the time it was being built, people criticized the Eiffel Tower as being a gross eyesore. Now one of the most famous symbols of France. When they were first painted, people criticized not one, but all of Van Gogh's paintings. In fact, in his lifetime, only one painting was ever sold. I mean, can you imagine that? Only one of his paintings was someone willing to take some money out and say, it's worth something. And now those same paintings sell for millions of dollars and hang in famous museums all over the world. People criticized Moses. People criticized the Apostle Paul. People even criticize Jesus Christ. Still do. You see, none of those people and none of those good works escaped criticism. And I want you to think about that for a moment as we head into maybe some troublesome times for Christians. Think of that. None of those people, none of them, and none of those good works escaped criticism. And I'll tell you, whenever you start a good work for God, whenever you start any good work of any significance or difficulty, you can be sure of one thing. And that is that one of the costs of doing it is that your Sanballat, your Tobiah, your Geshem the Arab will come. You can count on it. And so the point is to be ready for it. And count that as merely a small cost of doing something great, of something good. Because criticism is often a normal part of doing great things. And that includes doing good things for Jesus Christ. And so to me, the important question for us is, how did Nehemiah respond to those negative voices? Well, if you take a look, what we see is Nehemiah is anything but deterred. And we see exactly why in verse 20. In Nehemiah's response to Sanballat, to Tobiah, to Geshem the Arab, Nehemiah writes, I replied, the God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding the wall. And my question is, why was Nehemiah not deterred by criticism? Because Nehemiah knew that what was being done was squarely within the will of God. that God himself wanted this. And you see, for our parts, when we do things, we too need to check that our rebuilding projects are within God's will. And this is critically important. In fact, if you mess up on this, good luck. You see, in chapter 1, if you remember, Nehemiah spent 3 days fasting and praying to God. And so he is now clear, it's clear to him that God has put this plan on his heart. And what that means is nothing is going to stop Nehemiah. Nothing. And likewise, when we have taken time to check that our rebuilding projects, our efforts are within God's will, then nothing but God himself should ever stop it. And so Nehemiah fixes his sight on God and God's agenda. And keeps going, keeps rebuilding. The first hammer fall is followed by a second hammer fall and a third, and on and on. The project keeps moving forward. And as stated in verse 20, Nehemiah knows that if the rebuilding project is within God's will, that God himself will help it succeed. And I want you to take these words slowly. It's not that just God will be pleased that you're doing something he wants. It's that he will help it succeed. And that's a different statement. I can say, well, I'm glad you're doing that, but you're going to fail. Too bad. Nehemiah says here that God himself will help it succeed. He knows it's within God's will to do, and God will help it succeed. And that's all that Nehemiah needs to know. Period. Hand me another brick. And so in 1 minute or less, no one time me, but it'll be close. I want to summarize these 3 points that will help us in our rebuilding projects. The first thing is we need to consider as best we can whether it is within God's will. And I just want to tell you, I've been at a number of churches, and I'll tell you, no church ever says it isn't God's will. But let me tell you a secret. I've found that some churches follow their own plans, not God's. And that is a critical mistake. Everything that flows from that man-made desire for their own agenda will lead to failure. Many are the plans in man's heart, but the only one that's going to succeed is God's. And so you see, our whole goal as Spirit of Joy is to follow God's will. And only his good and right and pleasing will do. That's what made Nehemiah a success. He knew it was God's will. He wasn't going to stop with some criticism. The second thing is, for any rebuilding project, before starting, or if you've already started and you can't not start because you've already started, take some time to consider what the costs might be before you take the next step. Be honest about the situation. And do this not to deter you, but to prepare you. Because I'll tell you, anything worth doing is going to involve some hard work. And finally, third, when you start rebuilding, be ready for some buts. Expect some negative voices. And it may not even be other people's voices. You may get the negative voices in your own head. I can't do this. This is too tough. But don't be deterred by those negative voices. Instead, rest in the truth that God will help his plan to succeed. And then keep building. And so that's what I hope for Spirit of Joy, and I hope for everyone listening, and I hope for everyone, all the Christians in the world, is that they keep rebuilding and they don't look back. Once they put their hand to the plow, keep going. Because God will help us succeed in how he wants his will to work itself out. So I guess I could say, hand me another brick. So, amen.